I didn't know much of anything about what schizophrenia was before I was diagnosed. And so the first time my doctor told me that I have schizoaffective disorder, which is a combination of schizophrenia and a mood disorder, I was shocked. I was scared. I was anxious about what that meant. And, a lot of this had to do with what I've been fed by media in society. So much of what we're exposed to when it comes to talking about schizophrenia are really awful depictions of characters who are living with schizophrenia in popular media and of news stories of things that have gone really, really awry with someone who has schizophrenia. And so it's kind of no wonder that this was my immediate response to being told that I was living with schizophrenia. All of a sudden, I felt things like, well, am I dangerous? Am I going to need to be institutionalized? Will I be over-medicated for the rest of my life? Am I crazy? And the reason why I'm sharing this with you is because all of these, difficult things that came to the forefront of my mind when I was first diagnosed and beyond too, stem from stigma that exists within society. Now, there's a lot of talk about stigma when it comes to mental health. And, that's really great on one hand, where we are having more conversations about, addressing harmful stigma and negative stigma as it pertains to mental illnesses. I think where we're getting a little stuck, though, is we're focusing primarily on the more common mental illnesses like depression and anxiety. And, wonderful strides have been made in terms of reducing stigma around those illnesses. But in turn, what we're doing when we're reducing stigma around those illnesses is almost increasing stigma for the less talked about, more chronic mental illnesses like schizophrenia, like bipolar, like dissociative identity disorder. So in this video, we're going to be talking about why this stigma exists, where it comes from, why it's perpetuated, how to deal with it, and then also, more importantly almost, how to deal with the internalized stigma that I was kind of talking about in my story at the beginning of this video. All right, so starting off, where does stigma come from? I think a really easy one to kind of pinpoint as a source of negative stigma is popular media. So that is TV shows, movies, books, popular media that we consume that tells us stories that maybe aren't completely grounded in reality in terms of what an actual experience of living with schizophrenia is. I think so oftentimes, we've been fed this narrative of the schizophrenic who is a serial killer in Criminal Minds or some other show like that, where it is kind of like the person who's living with schizophrenia is this deranged, crazy killer. And that's, obviously problematic because that's just not the reality of, by and large, the huge majority of people who are living with an illness like schizophrenia. When we use an illness to kind of tell this warped, fantastical narrative for entertainment's value, that's really doing an incredible disservice to the population who actually lives with and experiences this illness on a daily basis. As far as storytelling goes, what these depictions are doing is ultimately creating a societal narrative where people who are living with schizophrenia are people you should be afraid of. There's also a flip side to this where it's not just that, people with schizophrenia are portrayed as dangerous or unpredictable or unstable, but they're also sometimes portrayed as these, misunderstood geniuses or creative geniuses. Think A Beautiful Mind, where, it's this highly romanticized notion of what it means to be living with an illness like schizophrenia, which in and of itself, again, is also doing a disservice to people who are living with it and navigating it on a daily basis. So these narratives that we're fed from popular media are kind of an easy one to point at in terms of where some negative stigma is coming from. But what I want to talk about now is more of social issues that exist that pertain to schizophrenia or people who are living with schizophrenia that are kind of more enmeshed in terms of our understanding of mental health and of people who are living with schizophrenia. It's an unfortunate reality that people who are living with schizophrenia face higher rates of things like houselessness or addiction and substance use and these kind of co-occurring issues. I think that that's unfortunately something that comes to the forefront of people's minds when they think about what it means to live with schizophrenia is that unfortunate image in their head of someone who is experiencing houselessness talking to themselves on the side of the street. And I think that that kind of narrative often takes up a little bit too much space in our collective minds about what it means to experience schizophrenia. However, I think what we're missing here when we do see things like this happening is that these people who are experiencing schizophrenia and houselessness and addiction or substance use are ultimately people who are falling through the cracks of our mental health care system. The stigma that we are ultimately putting on them with our negative assumptions and judgments about why they're living on the street or what it means to be living on the street is ultimately feeding this cycle of them not being able to access help through the mental health care system and the stigma that they face within that healthcare system as well. And it's just kind of this awful cycle that largely is perpetuated by stigmatized understandings of what's happening. Another thing that kind of gets overblown within our societal understanding of it is violence as it pertains to schizophrenia. A lot of news stories and whatnot that we hear about someone who's living with schizophrenia tend to have to do with some sort of violent act that was committed while the person was in psychosis. And I'm not going to, lie and say this doesn't happen at all, because it does. But I think that we really overemphasize this as an occurrence for people who are living with schizophrenia in the news and in media and whatnot. And that's a problem. I think more often than not, people who are living with schizophrenia are, more violent to themselves, unfortunately, than to other people. And this often takes the form of increased suicide attempts or dying by suicide. Suicide is another really highly stigmatized thing within our society. And so this is just kind of another way where we're kind of loading on and layering the stigma that someone with schizophrenia is experiencing. There has been more and more talk as of late about changing the name of schizophrenia to, try to eliminate or reduce some of the negative stigma that is kind of imbued in it. And I'm not sure where I land on this issue, but there is definitely stigma inherent in just how we talk about schizophrenia, the names we give it, and the terms that we use. Psychosis is something that is often talked about as it pertains to a person's experience of schizophrenia. And I think oftentimes people kind of hear the term psychosis and assume psychopath or psychotic. And I guess psychotic is a proper term to be used for when someone is experiencing psychosis, but I think there's a lot of negative assumptions and misunderstandings inherent in what that means. First of all, psychopath, which a lot of people jump to, is a completely different thing, its own stigmatized thing, but just not what schizophrenia is. Schizo in schizophrenia has also kind of come to be understood as dissociative identity disorder, or what used to be referred to as multiple personality disorder. People often hear schizophrenia and they think, oh yeah, like multiple personalities. And that is so far from what it actually is. And I guess dissociative identity disorder, again, is its own stigmatized thing, but they're very different. And so I think just more education is needed around all of these stigmatized concepts and terms. It kind of seems like the term schizo has kind of become a bit of a derogatory term for really anything that is unpredictable or unstable in nature. And that's obviously problematic. And then there's also language around the ways in which we treat schizophrenia. Largely what people who are living with schizophrenia take to manage their schizophrenia are antipsychotic drugs. And so this idea of people who are living with schizophrenia having to be medicated with antipsychotics is kind of an alarming term for people who may not know much about it. And to take that a step further, often people who are living with schizophrenia take antipsychotics in the form of an injection or a depot. And this can be, even more of a stigmatized conception about, being medically injected with antipsychotics to be able to be out in the world. That narrative around this can be a really stigmatizing one. Now, before I go any further, I just want to take a minute to ask you to please hit that like button. It really helps with the YouTube algorithm so that more people see this video. Ultimately, the way to reduce stigma is through education and awareness, and that is what we're trying to do with this video. And so the more people who see it, the better. Thank you for your help. So the next big topic that I want to tackle in this video is, I think, the most important one, and that is around self-stigma or internalized stigma. And so that is kind of what I was talking about back at the beginning of this video, about what I was feeling when I first learned that I was being diagnosed with schizoaffective disorder, where I had all of these internalized understandings of what schizophrenia meant from messages that I was being fed from society as a whole. I don't think I, was born with this understanding that I should be afraid of being diagnosed with an illness like schizophrenia, or that it meant that my life would end in some way. But these are the messages that I had been fed throughout my life, growing up and whatnot, that made me have this internalized understanding of what it means to live with an illness like schizophrenia. So, there's some obvious ways how this can be really problematic in terms of creating a lot of inner conflict and unrest about what it means to live with the illness you're living with. I think when you're fed these narratives that when you are living with schizophrenia, it means that you are crazy or you are dangerous or that you ultimately won't be able to lead a full, meaningful life, I think it becomes really difficult to challenge those notions on an internal basis. And you start to question, well, am I crazy? Am I dangerous? Can I lead a full and meaningful life? And the more you start to question that, the more kind of out of reach these things become. And so, this obviously creates even bigger of a problem. So that's kind of the fear side of this internalized stigma that people often experience. But then there's also the shame side where, you understand that society as a whole has these negative connotations about you as a person living with schizophrenia. And so you start to really internalize that and feel a lot of shame around the fact that you have this illness, which makes you want to hide it, which makes you want to pretend it doesn't exist sometimes, which can lead to anosognosia or other issues like that. So ultimately here, the stigma that exists within broader society leads to this sort of internalized stigma that someone who's living with schizophrenia experiences. And this internalized stigma can be the most difficult to overcome. Now, I think it would be one thing if this stigma that I've been talking about within society was, very overt and easily identifiable. I think it would be maybe easier to maybe pinpoint the problem, educate, and move on. But where we're at in terms of stigma as it pertains to illnesses like schizophrenia is a little bit more covert in nature. And, what I mean by this is that, for an example, in my own life, I was working at a mental health clinic of all places. And I began to experience difficulties with my mental health and I needed to take some time off. And I made the decision to self-disclose to my supervisor and her superiors or whatnot that I live with schizoaffective disorder. As soon as they found out my diagnosis and that I was dealing with a chronic illness like this, all of a sudden, communication just went way down. They started to skirt around issues. And ultimately, I was pushed out of my job. And this was at a mental health clinic where, mental health is supposed to be something that is widely accepted and, talked about and worked on, like that was literally our jobs. And yet, even in that environment, it was a really, really difficult thing for people to navigate because of, deep down feelings and assumptions that they have about people who are living with stigmatized illnesses like schizophrenia. And I think this goes further into all sorts of interactions that this really ingrained stigma makes more difficult. This can be, just talking with friends or family about your illness and them having stigmatized perceptions about it. This can be trying to get a job and people who you're trying to get a job from have stigmatized perceptions or understandings of your illness. And there are just so many ways in society where this ingrained stigma shows up and makes it more difficult for someone who's living with schizophrenia to fully engage in a meaningful way and in a way where anyone else would be able to. So what do we do about all this stigma? So I think in terms of navigating it on a public level, on the societal level, education is really, really important. The more that we educate ourselves and other people around us about, what it means to live with chronic illnesses like schizophrenia or any stigmatized illness like that, the better we're going to be able to properly address it and understand it from a place that isn't enmeshed in this stigmatized viewpoint. It's really important, like with anything else in life, to really work at challenging our own misconceptions and biases. Advocating for better policies and access to treatment will go a long way in terms of ensuring that people who are living with schizophrenia have access to proper treatment, and thus hopefully that will help to eliminate some of the negative stigma that is coming from the social issues and whatnot that I talked about earlier in the video, but also just creating better policies that don't have any of this negative stigma enmeshed in them either. And then, of course, normalizing conversations around topics like living with schizophrenia. I think the more we can, share about our experiences with schizophrenia without shame, and the more we can be receptive to hearing about experiences of living with schizophrenia without fear, the better we're going to be able to kind of shirk this negative stigma that is kind of enmeshed in our current understandings of what it means to live with schizophrenia. And in terms of dealing with stigma from a more internal perspective, I think first and foremost, a really important thing is self-acceptance. Now, this is not an easy thing to, come to or work on. It is definitely an ongoing journey and something that I have been working on for years and will continue to work on for years to come. But it's a really, really important one and is kind of crucial to overall wellness. Realizing that symptoms can be managed through different kinds of treatments is also kind of an important step in terms of reducing some of that internalized stigma. It is possible to manage your symptoms and to live a full and meaningful life, even if you are living with an illness like schizophrenia. Now, when I say manage, I don't necessarily mean that all days are going to be perfect good days where it is perfectly managed. There are going to be days where you still do deal with some of the realities of living with schizophrenia, and that is okay. That is part of the self-acceptance process where you come to a place of generally accepting that that is a part of living with the illness. You're going to have good days and bad days. If you have any other tips or tricks that have worked for you in terms of coming to a place of self-acceptance and addressing this internalized stigma, we would love to hear from you in the comments below. Please share them. They might help someone else too. Thank you so much for watching this video. And as always, wishing you and your loved ones good health. We'll see you in the next video. Bye.